You are working harder than any generation before you, more educated, more connected, more careful with every dollar you spend. And yet somehow, owning a home feels impossible. Having children feels risky. Even making $100,000 a year no longer feels safe. For millions of Gen Z adults, life doesn't feel like progress anymore. It feels like survival. This is not a motivational video. There are no 5 tips at the end, no hack that fixes this. What this is an honest conversation about what is actually happening to a generation that did everything right and still ended up holding a bill they never agreed to pay. If this hits something real for you, subscribe before we go deeper. Now let's get into it. Every generation gets handed a story about how life is supposed to work. For Gen Z, the story went like this: study hard, get the degree, land the job, save a little, buy the house, build the life. Simple, linear, achievable. The same story that worked for their parents, the same story their grandparents told with pride, the story that made sense when a teacher's salary could buy a 4-bedroom house and a factory worker could retire with dignity at 62. That story is still being told at kitchen tables, at graduation ceremonies, in career counseling offices at universities, charging $50,000 a year to deliver advice built for an economy that no longer exists. The story did not change, the economy did, and the gap between the story Gen Z was handed and the reality they walked into is not a small gap. It is not a manageable gap. It is the kind of gap that produces a specific kind of psychological damage that does not have a clean diagnosis because it is not a mental health problem. It is a reality problem, and reality problems do not respond to therapy alone. Let's talk about what actually changed, because the numbers are not subtle. In 1980, the median home in America cost around $60,000. The median household income was around $21,000. That is a ratio of roughly 3 to 1. You needed 3 years of total household income to buy the median home. Today, the median home costs over $400,000. The median household income is around $75,000. That is a ratio of more than 5 to 1 nationally. In cities where the jobs actually are, that ratio is 10 to 1, 15 to 1. In San Francisco, it is closer to 25 to 1. College tuition at a public university in 1980, adjusted for inflation, cost approximately $8,000 a year in today's money. Today, the average public university costs over $24,000 a year, including room and board. Private universities average over $55,000. The debt that Gen Z carries into the workforce is not a lifestyle choice. It is the price of the ticket they were told they needed to buy. Grocery prices increased 25% between 2020 and 2024. Rent increased over 30% nationally in the same period. The average new car cost $48,000. Health insurance premiums for a healthy 25-year-old in the individual market in most states now exceed $300 a month for a plan with a deductible so high it provides almost no practical protection for routine care. These are not vibes, these are not feelings, these are numbers, and the numbers tell a story that the avocado toast narrative was specifically designed to drown out. Because if the problem is lattes, then the solution is personal discipline, and nothing about the system needs to change. But if the problem is structural, if the problem is that wages did not keep pace with the cost of the things wages are supposed to buy, then the conversation becomes uncomfortable for everyone who benefited from the system while it was working differently. So the conversation stays on the lattes. The average American spends $1,200 a year on coffee. The median home price increased by over $140,000 between 2020 and 2023 alone. Cutting coffee for 116 years would close that gap. The math of the latte advice is not just wrong, it is a demonstration of how seriously the people giving it are not taking the actual problem. $100,000 a year used to mean something specific. It meant you had made it. Ask a Gen Z person earning $100,000 in a major American city what their life actually looks like. After federal and state taxes, the take-home lands somewhere around $65,000 depending on location. Rent for a 1-bedroom in a city where the jobs that pay $100,000 exist runs between $20,000 and $36,000 a year. That is gone before food, transportation, student loans, health insurance, utilities, subscriptions, and the basic ongoing cost of being an adult human in 2024. Run that math completely, and the person earning $100,000 is sometimes saving less than the person earning $50,000 in a lower cost market. The income is real. The wealth it is supposed to represent is an illusion. A number that stopped meaning what it once meant without anyone making an official announcement. $100,000 is not rich anymore. In most major cities, it is barely comfortable. In some, it is just a faster treadmill. And the psychological weight of that is a specific kind of suffering that has no validated language. You cannot feel poor at six figures. The culture will not allow it. So the people around you who are struggling harder will not validate it. And the part of your brain that remembers what 100,000 meant to your parents will not let you grieve it either. So it becomes a private shame carried quietly inside a public performance of doing fine. Doing fine is exhausting to perform indefinitely. And Gen Z has been performing it for years. Nothing makes the scale of what changed more visible than housing. Nothing. Home ownership was not just a financial milestone for previous generations. It was the mechanism through which ordinary working families built wealth. The equity in a home, purchased in 1985 or 1995 or even 2005, has compounded into the primary asset most middle-class American families hold today. It is the inheritance that is coming. It is the retirement that works. It is the stability that every other plan was built on top of. Gen Z is being priced out of that foundation in real time. Not gradually, rapidly, and permanently if the structural conditions do not change. In 1980, it took approximately 3 years of median household income to save a 20% down payment on a median-priced home. Today, in most major markets, saving that down payment takes between 10 and 20 years at savings rates that the cost of living makes nearly impossible to sustain. And while you spend 10 years saving, the prices keep moving. The target is not standing still, it is accelerating. For the first time in modern American history, a generation is on track to have lower rates of home ownership than their parents. Not because they made worse decisions, because the market structurally changed underneath them. Restrictive zoning, chronic underbuilding, institutional investors purchasing single-family homes at scale, interest rates on 30-year mortgages that nearly doubled between 2021 and 2023. These are not personal failures, they are policy outcomes, and the people experiencing them are being told to budget better. The grief of that is real. And it compounds when the people in power treat it as an attitude problem rather than a housing policy failure, and then there is the phone. Every previous generation that financially struggled in relative privacy. The comparison was local. Your street, your workplace, the people you could physically see. The gap between your life and the life of someone dramatically wealthier existed, but it was not delivered to you in high resolution at every moment of every day. Gen Z grew up with a comparison engine in their pocket that never powers down. And the comparison is not between your life and the average life. It is between your life and the most curated, optimized presentation of the most exceptional moments of people who are either significantly wealthier than you or performing a lifestyle financed by debt and anxiety they are not showing you. The psychological research on social comparison is not ambiguous. Upward social comparison produces anxiety, reduces satisfaction, increases spending as people attempt to close a perceived gap that the algorithm is specifically designed to make feel closable if you just buy the right thing. Social media is an upward comparison machine running 24 hours delivering the most extreme version of that comparison at the exact moment when Gen Z is most financially vulnerable and most emotionally susceptible to what it produces. You're not just surviving a difficult economy, you're surviving a difficult economy while an algorithm shows you the highlight reel of everyone who appears to be thriving inside it. Knowing the comparison is not real does not make it stop working. The brain does not have a filter that says this is curated, ignore the emotional response. It responds to the image. It generates the feeling, and the feeling lands on top of financial stress that is already real and makes everything heavier than it already was. At some point, the grind stops feeling like momentum and starts feeling like running in place. Burnout has always existed. But the specific texture of Gen Z burnout has something in it that previous generations did not carry at the same scale. It is not just physical exhaustion from overwork. It is the particular exhaustion that comes from working hard toward a goal that keeps moving. from doing everything the system asked and finding that the system is not holding up its end of the agreement. When effort produces results, the tiredness is bearable. It is the tiredness of someone building something. The cost has a product, the sacrifice has a return, but when effort stops producing the expected result, when the hours go in and the financial position does not improve, and the house gets further away, and the savings account does not grow, and the debt does not move, the exhaustion becomes something different, heavier, the tiredness of someone who has started to question whether the treadmill is going anywhere at all. This is the meaning crisis underneath the financial crisis. Gen Z is not just struggling to afford things. The inability to afford things is undermining the story they were supposed to be able to tell about their own lives. The story of progress, of building, of each year being measurably better than the last. When the evidence stops supporting that story, the psychological damage is not just stress. It is the loss of narrative. And humans without a workable narrative about their own lives are not okay. The mental health crisis in Gen Z is not separate from the financial crisis. It is the same crisis speaking two different languages: the anxiety, the depression, the sense of meaninglessness. These are not character defects in a generation. They are the predictable psychological outputs of an economic environment that removed the feedback loop between effort and outcome that human beings require to believe their actions have consequences worth caring about. There's a fear that lives specifically in the 20s that previous generations did not carry at the same frequency. The fear of wasting them, of arriving at 30 and discovering that the decade that was supposed to be the foundation of everything was spent in survival mode, spent anxious, spent in jobs that paid just enough to stay, but not enough to build anything, spent watching the financial milestones the culture said should be happening, by now recede further into a future that keeps moving. This fear is not irrational. The decisions made in your 20s do compound. The investment not made at 23 is genuinely more expensive at 33. The career risk not taken at 25 is harder to take at 35 when the obligations are larger and the margin for failure is smaller. Early adulthood is a real resource that does not fully renew. But the fear does not account for one thing. You cannot invest money you do not have. You cannot take career risks when your financial position has no margin for the risk to fail. You cannot build when survival is consuming every available unit of energy. The advice to use your 20s well was written for people whose 20s had enough slack in them to allow for the kind of deliberate building that produces compounding returns. For a generation in survival mode, the fear of wasting their 20s is an additional tax on an already overtaxed emotional balance sheet. You are not wasting your 20s, you are surviving them. In conditions that make survival genuinely hard, and that is not the same thing. The cruelest part is not the conditions, it is being told the conditions are your fault. The narrative that Gen Z is struggling because of personal irresponsibility is not just factually wrong, it serves a specific function. If the problem is individual behavior, then the solution is individual behavior change, and the systems producing the conditions never need to be examined or reformed. If the problem is structural, then the conversation becomes uncomfortable for everyone who designed or benefited from the structure while it was working differently for them. So the conversation stays on the lattes, on the subscriptions, on the entitlement, on the unrealistic expectations, on the inability to delay gratification. These are the narratives that keep the focus on the individual and away from the policy. Away from the housing legislation, away from the wage stagnation, away from the student loan industry, away from the healthcare system, away from every structural decision made over the past 40 years that transferred economic security from workers to capital and then blamed workers for feeling insecure. Gen Z did not create the conditions they are living in, they inherited them, and the least the conversation owes them is honesty about that. So what is actually true about all of this? It is true that the economy Gen Z inherited is structurally harder to build wealth inside than the economy their parents navigated. That is not a feeling. That is measurable in housing ratios and wage data and debt levels and the cost of healthcare and education relative to income. It is true that the psychological cost of trying to build a life in these conditions is real and under-acknowledged, that the anxiety is not weakness, the burnout is not laziness, the hopelessness is not entitlement. They are rational responses to genuinely difficult conditions being carried by people who were told the conditions would be different. it is true that individual choices still matter inside these conditions. They always do. But they matter less than the narrative around personal responsibility suggests, and more than the despair of survival mode allows people to believe. The margin is smaller than it should be. It is not zero. And it is true that Gen Z is not a generation that failed. It is a generation that was handed a broken system, given advice for a functional one, and told that the gap between the advice and the reality was their personal problem to solve. Maybe the most honest thing that can be said is this: Gen Z is not financially irresponsible. Gen Z is not lazy. Gen Z is not entitled for wanting the things that previous generations received as the baseline return on basic adult effort. Gen Z is trying to survive in an economy completely different from the one they were prepared for, without the map, without the margin, and largely without acknowledgement from the systems and the people that created the conditions they are navigating every single day. That deserves to be said clearly, not as an excuse, as an accurate accounting of what is actually happening. The feeling is not in your head. You're not behind. You're not failing. You're navigating something genuinely hard with fewer resources and less acknowledgement than the difficulty deserves. And you're not alone in it. Subscribe if this said something real. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and come back next week, because we are going into exactly what the financial moves still look like inside the system as it actually exists right now, not as it was supposed to be, as it is. See you there.